All right, so as I said, today we are starting a 3-part series all about Zapier and Dubsado, and today's webinar is focused on sending new Dubsado leads over to a Google Sheet using Zapier. So this is an automation. So the goal for today's webinar is to just learn the basics of using Zapier with Dubsado. I'm going to go over what Zapier is and just the kind of basic fundamentals you need to know to get started. And then we'll go ahead and set up that Zap together in real time so you can see how to get that started. And I do want to say a couple words too on Zapier just before we jump in. It is a pretty robust tool that you can use in your business. There's a lot of great opportunities for automation. It does have a big learning curve, and you do have to be ready to maybe do some trial and error, some testing. Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. It's definitely something doable that you can set up in your business, but just go in with the right mindset that it's going to take some learning, take some time to figure out, but I promise it pays back big time when you get it set up if you need some of these automations. All right. I should also mention that too, I am not affiliated with Zapier in any way. Dubsado does not have an official partnership or affiliation with Zapier other than, of course, our integration. So just to get that out in the open, I'm not a representative for Zapier, only with Dubsado, but I do have the knowledge, so I want to share it with you. All right, so as usual with situations with Sam, this is not a Dubsado sort of beginner's webinar. I am expecting that you're familiar with the basics of Dubsado, and for this webinar in particular, you want to be familiar with lead capture forms, especially mapping fields on those forms, mapping your short answer and date fields, and using custom mapped fields. Those tend to come up a lot when we're talking about Zapier. So if you need a refresher on any of those, in the handout, I've included links to our help articles on those topics for you. And what will we need for setting this integration up? Well, first of all, you will need a Zapier account. So this is a separate platform to sign up for. Everything we're talking about today can be done with a free Zapier account. So there's no requirement to have a paid account in order to basically replicate what we're doing today. When we get to the end of the series in the third webinar, I'm going to be going over some advanced strategies that would require a paid account. You can absolutely get started for free. You're going to need to have Zapier connected to Dubsado. So I've linked the help article here. I'm not going to go over that specifically. We do have a great help article on this that I put together with some instructive GIFs and screenshots, and it walks you through the process of setting up the integration. I promise you got this. It's pretty easy to set up. So you want to get that set up before you try to make your Zap. We're also going to be using a Google Sheet with some kind of special setup ahead of time, and I'll show you what that looks like, and a lead capture form specifically for this integration we're setting up. But any lead capture form you have will do. We'll just talk about what kind of happens between the lead capture form and Zapier, just so you can make sure you're happy with everything set up. All right, so let's start with some Zapier basics. What is Zapier? Maybe you are curious about it. You know it automates things, but you're not exactly sure what it is. So let's go over that. It's an online automation tool that connects I just looked today, over 2,000 of your favorite apps to each other, so you can automate these repetitive tasks that you have in your business. And the cool thing about Zapier is it's this platform that essentially created a common language for different apps to use. So Dubsado could make an integration with Zapier, and then Google Sheets could make their integration with Zapier, and we're both speaking the same language without Dubsado having to make the direct integration with Google Sheets. So Zapier kind of acts as that platform with a common language where these apps can build these integrations and connect with one another. So the creativity potential is huge with this, given the number of apps that are integrating with this platform. So how does this happen? In Zapier, you set up the integrations between these apps by creating something called a Zap. It's the automation. So Zaps are sort of like workflows in Dubsado in that they are a series of automated steps. And so the difference here is that where a workflow in Dubsado, you either apply it manually to a project or maybe start it from another workflow, or very commonly, the workflow is getting started from the lead capture form. In Zapier, a Zap always starts with a trigger action. So it's the something that happens, it's the event that happens in one app that then triggers the Zap to start running and go through the actions, the next steps, in the other app or apps. So if we just look at an example I've already built here, just to show you this is kind of what we're getting to today. This first step at the top, when this happens, a new project is created as a lead in Dubsado, then do this, create a spreadsheet row in Google Sheets. So a new project getting created in Dubsado with a lead status is the trigger. That's what Zapier is watching to have happen before it starts running the automation. And then the action in this case is creating a spreadsheet row on our Google Sheet. So that's at a very basic level, the structure of a Zap and how it gets set up. So once you turn the Zap on, you can turn it on or off at any time. The Zap will just run automatically anytime the trigger occurs. So when you set up the integration between Zapier and Dubsado, Zapier is just kind of watching Dubsado for that trigger to happen to set off your Zap. We talked about the fact that Zapier has a free plan that you can use. There are going to be some limitations there, namely this would be kind of the limit to what you can build in a Zap. You're not going to be able to build out more than just a trigger and then one step afterwards. So great for simple automations. There are also going to be limitations on how often your automation can run on a free account, but it does serve the needs for many. And then, of course, just another reminder to use Zapier with Dubsado, you are going to need to set up the integration, and the instructions are in the help article that I've linked throughout this handout. So actions and triggers, let's dive into that a little bit more. As I mentioned, the trigger is what starts the Zap off. So every Zap will only have one trigger. It's the event that happens that kicks the whole automation off. And then the actions are going to be the automated steps that follow the trigger. And there are a couple different types of actions. Some of them are called actions in Zapier. Some of them are called searches. There's some other things that can happen, but just on a basic level, we can refer to something like this step, creating a spreadsheet in Google, spreadsheet row in our Google Sheet as an action. So these are, the steps between the two different apps. And usually an action is going to involve adding, changing, or finding information, which I may also call data, in another app. So in this situation, creating a row in Google Sheets, we are basically writing new data into our Google Sheet. So it's a creative action. So that's being taken in that second app. And you are going to be limited to the actions and triggers that have been made available by each app's developers in their integration. So when an app like Dubsado creates an integration with Zapier, we determine what kind of triggers and actions will be available for you to use based on what we create. So Dubsado has actually 5 triggers, and we do have one action, which we'll actually talk about in the next webinar in the series. We won't be talking about the action today. And something you want to do, kind of before you get too stuck into setting up a Zap, is you want to do a little bit of research. So I'm actually going to exit out of here. And Zapier has this search bar at the top where you can search for the apps that you're interested in connecting. So I can search Dubsado. This is the first step I take when I kind of think of an automation, something pops in my head. My first step is to find out, is it possible? Do I have the tools I would need for this at my disposal? So every app on Zapier has kind of their own homepage and info page like this. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, in the middle here, there are going to be some suggestions that you could start with. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll find the integration details. And this will tell you what triggers and actions and maybe search functions are available for this particular app. So you can see our 5 triggers here. We have when a contract gets signed. So this will run anytime a client submits any signed contract. We have new payment received. So this will run anytime a client makes a payment on an invoice through a payment processor. We have project status updated. So this will trigger anytime any project status is updated. We have the one we're using in our example today, a new project as a lead. So this will trigger when a new project gets created either manually through a lead capture form or a public proposal. And as long as it has a lead status, right? So as the project gets created, you've chosen a lead status for it. And then very similar, a new project as a job. So this would trigger anytime a new project is created under those circumstances, but with a job status. So these are the available triggers. And we do have one action is to create a new project. So you are bound by the triggers that we have available here. We are, always looking at new things to do in the future, but this is actually a pretty recent update. So we're very excited to have these new triggers here, and that's what will be available to you in Zapier for Dubsado. So let's talk about data a little bit. Data is a big part of Zaps because oftentimes we want to transfer information or data from one app to another. It's exactly what we're doing here. We want the data from our new Dubsado lead to be placed onto our Google Sheet. So the data is going to be an important thing. When you have a trigger in Zapier, so looking at like our new project as lead trigger, when that trigger sets off the Zap, it's going to bring in some data, some information about the new lead that was created. And then you can take that information, and Zapier helps walk you through this. You can take that information and tell Zapier where you want it to go in the next app. So very cool. We'll be walking through that in a little bit. And again, the data and which fields are available for you to map that data into, those are also dependent on how the app designed the integration. So everything is kind of determined by what's possible in the app that is offering the integration. So it's very different from app to app and even between triggers and actions within the same app on Zapier. So that's why I mentioned the first step before creating a Zap is to really do this little bit of research and planning. So go through on Zapier, look at the apps you're wanting to connect, learn about the information that they have, and you can even kind of compare two together using this search bar. So it's a very important step. Okay, so those are the Zapier basics down. Let's actually get into building the Zap. So there are a couple of preparations you should take. In this case, I'm going to be assuming that you would be using a lead capture form. So I want to talk about, what kind of should go into that lead capture form. So I have over here in my account. I just had the integrations page open here, which is where you'll set up your Zapier connection. Let's go to our lead capture form that I've set up for this webinar. Just a simple kind of like a wedding photography inquiry as a simple example. Very important, as we just talked about data, the way Dubsado is able to share and store data is through mapped fields. So any field on your lead capture form where you want that data to be available in Zapier, it's going to have to be mapped. So of course, we have our first name, last name, email fields for the client that should be mapped and required. The fiance's information, we have that mapped to the alt contact fields. We have a date select field here, mapping to the project date. And we have a couple, we have a short answer field here, just asking about the wedding vibe. And this is a project tracking element. So the client can report how they found out about you. The project source is actually going to be available data in Zapier, which is really cool. Now, something like a free response field, this is not able to be mapped. We don't have that option here. So anything entered in a free response field, as well as a yes or no question, a drop-down box, or check boxes, these are not going to be mappable over to Zapier because we can't map them in Dubsado, so that data will not be transferred to Zapier. So just keep that in mind. For example, if I had used a drop-down box or some check boxes to ask the client what their wedding day vibe would be, we would not be able to pull that information over through Zapier. Dubsado wouldn't send it over. And this is where I mentioned custom map fields would come in handy too, right? So something like the vibe, I set up a project mapped field. This is a custom project map field specifically for that information. So you may need to think about setting up some custom mapped fields if you haven't already in order to make that information available. File uploader would also not be able to send files through Zapier. So just remember, only information that is being entered in a short answer field or a date select field that's been mapped. Just as a starting point, that's the only info that you'll find over in Zapier when this trigger occurs. And we do have a help article that I've linked in the handout at the bottom that goes over all the fields available for each of the triggers. So that's a good thing, a good reference to look at. Let's see, what else do we need to prep? Oh yes, I almost forgot to mention in the settings tab of your lead capture form. Let's find our way back there. Again, if you're using the new project as lead trigger, make sure that if you're setting a custom status here, that's going under a lead status, a lead categorized status. Great. So the next portion would be looking at our Google Sheet. So we have to do some prep in the other app as well. For your Google Sheet, you're going to need to just start a blank sheet. And then up here across the top in our first row, we want to set some column headers. So all you're going to do is just the information that you want entered on the sheet in each column. You just want to put sort of the title of that information in the first cell of each column across the top. So I have that set up here. And you may want to be specific as well with what you are putting in if you have two that look similar, because you're going to be, having to identify these in Zapier later. So this is a good thing to do. That's pretty much the setup for your Google Sheet, just getting those column headings done. And of course, just another reminder, set up that integration with Dubsado in your account. All right, so creating the trigger. Let's actually start building the Zap. So I'm going to go over to Zapier and you'll click the bright orange Make a Zap button here at the top. And you can give your Zap a name. I recommend something descriptive to what it does, because you can have more than one Zap in your account. So it's good to know something like Dubsado leads to Google Sheet. Great. So the first step is setting up our trigger, and you can use the search bar here. You want to find the app that you're using to trigger the Zap. So in our case, our trigger is through Dubsado. So we're going to just search for Dubsado and pull that up. And then it's going to ask you to choose the trigger event. So we're choosing from those options we looked at earlier. For this example, we're using new project as lead. Great, and continue. Zapier really walks you through the process. It's helpful to know kind of what it's asking, but it does quite a good job of walking you through the process. So the next step here is to select the account. So assuming you have the integration set up already, you'll be able to just select it right here. A good thing to know is that if you have multiple brands, each brand can be integrated with Dubsado separately. So it's good to just keep that in mind as well, that you can have a different brand running the Zaps here. So we have just the one connected. So I'll go ahead and click continue. Now, this is a really important step. It's time to bring in some sample data. So in order to set up our Zap correctly, I talked about the field mapping before. Zapier wants to actually go out to Dubsado, bring in some sample data for us to use so that's easier to set up our action. So how do we do this? Well, what I recommend doing is to actually go ahead and open up your lead capture form using the direct link. So I have my lead capture form set up and opened here, and I've opened it using the direct link from the share button. And we're actually going to fill it out as if we were a client. For best results, I recommend filling it out as a client that doesn't exist in your address book yet. So using an email that's not in your address book will make sure you kind of get a clean set of sample data, nothing carried over from an existing client profile. So I've gone ahead and filled this out in all the fields here, and I'll click send. And you do actually want to submit this lead capture form right before you get to this step. So we're doing this kind of simultaneously. I have Zapier open. Before I click test and review, I'm going to go ahead and submit this lead capture form. The reason for that is when I come back into Zapier and click test and review, it's going to go out and look in Dubsado for this data, and it's not going to pull in all of your projects. This is not a free-for-all. It's only looking for kind of like the most recent samples. So it found 2 samples here. The top one should be the most recent. You can click on it to review the data that was submitted. So you want to kind of match it to what you remember filling in on your lead capture form. This looks correct. That's the wedding date I put in. And we'll talk about, what this data looks like in a bit. If you see something that says null, it just means there was no data entered on the form for that bit. So right here, location, this is referring to the project location. We didn't map any information into the project location fields, so it's showing as null. But this is a good opportunity to get familiar with what data Dubsado is sending over. So you can kind of see it all here, even if it wasn't on your lead capture form. We've got our source, the vibe came right over. We have the status as part of it, the client information. So this looks all good. We have project A selected. And with the preferred sample selected, you can click done editing. If you go ahead and create that sample data, essentially what we did is we kind of simulated what would happen if the trigger went off on its own. So if I were trying to set something up for the contract signed the contract sign trigger, I would sign a contract first. So you want to just kind of simulate what the trigger is before reaching out for this data, because that's what Zapier is going to look for. If you did that and it's not showing up, you can click Get More Samples, and that will refresh. If you're having a lot of trouble with this, you might need to disconnect and reconnect Dubsado and Zapier just to refresh that connection. But you should see your most recent sample come up. So I'll click Done Editing, and we'll move forward with that sample data. All right, so the next step is setting up the action. Very exciting. So for do this, we'll just click anywhere on this step. And very much like the trigger, we have to choose the app first. So Google Sheets is pulled up right here, so I'll go ahead and click on it. And we need to choose the action event. In this case, we're creating a new spreadsheet row. So we want to add the new data from each lead on a new row of our spreadsheet each time. Great, continue. And just like Dubsado, we got to select the account. If you don't have an account for an app connected, you do have this option to add a new account, and it will help walk you through the steps. I have my Google account already connected, so on we go. And this is the first few steps in customizing how we want the data to come over. So the first step here is we actually have to tell Zapier where is the spreadsheet that we're bringing the data over to. It's important that the spreadsheet was created first so that we can pull in this information. So Zapier is now looking at my Google Drive account. I'll just specify that it's in my Google Drive. And under Spreadsheet, we want to click on the spreadsheet name that we set up. So it's called Dubsado Leads. And inside of the spreadsheet, you're going to have these tabs at the bottom. These are the worksheets. So ours only has one worksheet, just this one tab. If you created something with multiple tabs, you would be selecting between those. But from this dropdown, it'll show you the choices specifically now from this spreadsheet. So Zapier is very smart. It starts filling in the information as you go along. And as soon as I did that, look, it brought in some more fields. This is very cool. I love nerding out about Zapier. So it brought in all of our fields. These should look very familiar because they line up with what we put across the top in our spreadsheet. Very, very cool. So now we've reached the portion where we need to map all the information in. We have to tell Zapier where to put the data from Dubsado on our Google spreadsheet. So first field here is the name, client's name. To map information in, you'll just click on this kind of plus button at the end, insert a field, and it will show you the available fields from your trigger. Or if you have a more complex Zap, there might be more options here. But these are the options, and you can see where the sample data really comes in handy, because instead of just having to guess what this field will fill in, you actually have the sample data pulling in so that you can kind of preview what it would look like if the Zap were running on the sample you made. So I happen to know that not only do we have first name and last name as separate fields, Dubsado also lets you pull in the full name just as one. So I'm going to choose that for this one, just to do something a little different. Obviously, you'll want to pull in the data that is relevant to your needs. Email, so you can just kind of go through the list and you want to make sure it's matching up with what you remember entering. Fiance, so we're going to find the alt contact name, something that will help, especially with Dubsado. We have a lot of data coming over, a lot of different data fields. So we have a search bar here. I can start typing for the alt. There we go. We have our client alt contact name. Same thing here, the alt contact email. It's very simple. It sounds scary at first, mapping in all this data, but it's actually a very simple process, matching everything up. Okay, a date. This is important to think about. In this case, I want the inquiry date. So Dubsado does pull over a created date as part of what's being sent from the trigger. But I want to point out that we actually have two versions of this date. We have the created at, and it looks pretty familiar. We can see, kind of today's date in here with a time. But then, we also have this other version, which looks more readable, the pretty version. We do this because there might be different reasons you're using the date. If you're trying to fill the date in as text, maybe on, I don't know, some kind of document or something, you just want the text to read out, maybe in an email, so you could trigger an email to send in another app through Zapier. You want to just read out the text in a human readable format. That will be when you use the pretty date. If we're doing something like a spreadsheet where we might want to do calculations or sorting, charts and graphs based on time frames, we want to use this kind of ugly version of the date because this is what a spreadsheet can read as a real date format. This would just be text. This is a date that something like a spreadsheet can actually use. You might see the same thing in some apps with currency as well. There might be a pretty version and a kind of normal version, data version. We also want to bring in the wedding date, and let's see, that'll be connected to the project start. Oh, I think it's just called start in here. There we go. I also want the traditional date format. We got the vibe. So it takes a little bit of time to just set everything up, and the source. And you'll, again, as I mentioned, there's a bit of a learning curve with this. You have to gain some comfort working in Zapier. The more you do it, the faster you can kind of go through and start to recognize how to find the data when you're mapping it. It all kind of comes with time, but very straightforward, just kind of matching things up. This is also a text field that you could type into as well. So I could just type in some text, but this would be fixed text. So if we're almost thinking like in Dubsado terms with smart fields, you can think of each of these little I don't know, what would we call these, like they're sort of like smart fields really that we brought in through the Zapier interface. These will update each time the Zap runs with whatever data is brought in each time it gets triggered. But if you write in something, if you type something in directly, that's going to be kind of like fixed text that never changes. So you want to just think about that. Sometimes that's a really useful tool, but in our case, we wouldn't want to be bringing in any fixed text each and every time for this field. Another thing is Zapier does not like it when you change columns in your Google spreadsheet. So try to get those columns set as you like them. Try not to be changing the order or changing them around too much once you set this up. If you do need to change it, you can always go back and edit the Zap, but you may have to click refresh fields and it will kind of do a refresh here. And especially if you reordered them, you might have to go through and do some remapping. If you need to change something, if you made a mistake, this is almost just like text. You can click, or not click, you can, click into the field and then use the backspace key on your keyboard to remove it and remap it. So just keep that in mind. We'll add that back in and click continue with all of our fields mapped. Awesome. So now Zapier is showing us sort of a summary of what it thinks it wants us to do. So you can kind of look through this if you want and maybe catch at a glance if you, misaligned some of the information. If you did, you can go back to clicking on that drop down and go back through again. Once you're ready, go ahead and click test and review. So now we're at the stage of actually testing our Zap. This is very exciting. When I click test and review, Zapier is actually going to run the automation just as if we had it working automatically. So it's going to actually create the row in our Google Sheet. So I'll click test and review, and you should see a green success notification appear. If something went wrong, it will let you know and give you an error and hopefully some information on how to fix it. But let's go over to our spreadsheet, and hey, look at that. The information came right over. Very, very cool. So that information came right in from Dubsado. Zapier sent it over. So you can think about how powerful this would be if you really want to, use a spreadsheet like Google Sheets. I know Airtable is another popular one, to kind of constantly be collecting data on your leads or other information from Dubsado that's available with the triggers. You just have this constantly updating spreadsheet with all this data. You can really build charts and graphs and, really go beyond what's available to you just in Dubsado. So Zapier really makes that a feasible thing by entering all this data for you. All right. So as long as the test was successful, which this looks good here, you should be good to go forward. Again, if it didn't go right or you didn't get what you expected, you can always go back to customizing this action and kind of remap some things, get it working. At the end, you can click Done Editing, and your Zap will be ready to turn on. So when you turn the Zap on, that means it's going to be, active and running automatically. So the next person who fills out a lead capture form, the next time you manually create a project with a lead status, the Zap will be triggered and it will run. So we can go ahead and click Turn Zap On. And it's so nice too that Zapier has the testing built right in, so you have confidence that what you set up is going to work as you expect. You should see that toggle turn on here. We can go back to our Zaps and can see I have the kind of pre-made version that we looked at earlier. That one's turned off and this one's turned on. So from your Zapier My Zaps page, you can toggle which Zaps you want to be running and which ones you want turned off. Another cool thing you can do is with the little drop-down arrow next to a Zap, you can click down here and choose Task History. And this will take you to a page that basically logs all the times your Zap ran, and you can identify if it's throwing any errors at certain locations to kind of make sure that over time it's running as you expect. I do want to point out something here that I used a specific lead capture form to help me create the sample data for the Zap. So even though I did that though, this Zap will trigger indiscriminately of whether the client fills out that lead capture form, another lead capture form, you make the project manually and set it as a lead. The Zap on its own, as we created it, if we go back here, it just has two steps. Anytime a new project as a lead is created in Dubsado, it runs, and then it's going to follow through on this action. So if you are looking to kind of have it only run a certain Zap or only run a certain way when a particular lead capture form is filled out, or only when they select a certain option from a workflow drop down, a workflow element on your lead capture, that's something we're going to talk about in part 3 of the webinar series. So that's a more advanced technique using filtering and paths, and a paid Zapier account is required for that. So if you want to stick to keeping it simple and using the free account, just bear in mind that with those two steps, the trigger and the action, there's not anything to kind of automatically filter out. But I do still recommend using kind of your lead capture form to help you create the sample, because you want to kind of mirror as closely as possible, simulate as closely as possible how those new leads will be coming in, so that that you've put all the right fields on your spreadsheet and you got everything mapped in that you want. So stick around for part 3. That's coming up in another few weeks to learn more about those filtering and path options if you really want to get fancy with your Zapier integration. That's pretty much it for building Zaps. That is the process for building a Zap, the basics of Zapier. This is something you can go out and replicate in your own account right now. We have some other ideas that I listed here. These are also in our help articles about other ways you can use Dubsado triggered Zaps. Popular one is there's a built-in SMS notification kind of app that Zapier offers. So you could get a text every time you get a new lead in Dubsado. I know for those of you who have more robust task management needs, you're using Asana or ClickUp or Trello, you can explore those integrations. You could kind of trigger something to happen over there when you get a new lead or maybe a new job. And you can also use this as a way we get asked a lot. Do you integrate with MailChimp or any of the other kind of email marketing platforms? Yes, many of those platforms do have Zapier integrations, and you could send new Zapier leads over to those forms. I just have to disclaim for you that you and you alone are solely responsible for your own knowledge and compliance with email marketing and online privacy laws. So there are going to be different requirements in different regions about kind of automatically subscribing people to an email list. So you just want to make sure you're aware of those and take the proper steps. Dubsado and Zapier are not going to necessarily just automatically take care of that for you. You can do the spreadsheet row, which we just talked about, but maybe when you get a new job instead, so you can kind of use the distinction between those triggers to kind of help determine which projects are going on to your spreadsheet. And if you have a team, there are some kind of team collaboration apps like Slack available on Zapier as well. So you could send out a message to your team when someone either maybe signs their contract or you get a new job. So that is those are a couple different examples. But boy, there is a lot possible. So I could really only go through one specific example on the webinar. I wanted to choose one that was good for learning the basics of how to set up the Zap. So hopefully you can take that knowledge and build on it with whatever automation you are wanting to build in your business. And as I mentioned, I'm sharing the knowledge I have of using Zapier with you, but as I'm not affiliated with Zapier, I did want to point you to their Learning Center. They have some excellent resources. Definitely check those out. There will be, like I said, a bit of a learning curve getting acclimated and figuring out what's possible, but they have some great resources there for you. And of course, we have our own article detailing the triggers and the action available in Zapier now and what data comes along with each of those. So some resources there for you at the bottom. All right, guys, that was a great one. I hope that was helpful to you.